Iberoamericana en la última jornada de este coloquio M68, Ciudadanías en Movimiento. Ha sido un coloquio largo, con conversaciones sobre temas muy diversos, y hoy reservamos esta doble sesión para ligar el movimiento del 68 mexicano con los otros 68, con ese movimiento global que se expresó en Praga y se expresó en Tokio y lo vimos en París. Y hay una influencia importantísima, y es justamente sobre ella que centraremos hoy la atención, en los Estados Unidos. Es imposible no relacionar los mapas mentales, las reflexiones, las transformaciones que el movimiento de derechos civiles implicó para el movimiento del 68 mexicano, y desde luego dejar fuera ese terrible 68 en la historia de Estados Unidos que implicó la muerte de Robert Kennedy y la muerte de Luther King el mismo año, y que impactó en aquella generación. Justamente para abordar estos temas tenemos con nosotros a dos estudiosos, dos académicos, dos individuos que han dedicado buena parte de su carrera profesional a pensar los movimientos sociales, a pensar el liderazgo social y también a construir interpretaciones sociológicas, antropológicas del tema. Vamos a abrir primero con Aldon Morris y estará más tarde Thomas Rochon con nosotros, y luego tendremos una conversación los tres. Primero que nada presento a Aldon Morris. Aldon, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased to have you here at the UNAM. Aldon Morris es profesor de sociología y de estudios afroamericanos, y él es profesor, fue profesor en Northwestern University. Es un sociólogo muy reconocido, tiene una de las mejores biografías que hay en los orígenes, sobre los orígenes del movimiento de derechos civiles, y en tiempos más recientes viene a publicar un libro sobre Du Bois. Du Bois es uno de los grandes sociólogos, de los grandes fundadores de la sociología. Hay quien dice que fue alumno de Weber, he was a student of Weber, pero en realidad, vamos a escuchar a Aldon en un momento más, él insiste en que fue una relación recíproca, y Du Bois es uno de los precursores, en más de un sentido, de lo que ocurrió con el movimiento de derechos civiles, porque además de ser un gran académico, fue un gran activista. La idea con Aldon es que nos permita ligar en un span de tiempo mucho más amplio, digamos finales del siglo XIX y siglo XX, cómo el movimiento de derechos civiles fue gestándose y entender a partir de ahí el 68. Sin más preámbulo, Aldon, thank you very much for being here, and the voice is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is this working? It is a real distinct honor for me to be here today and to address you. I thank all of the people who played a role in making my visit possible. I first was contacted by Dr., I guess you pronounce it Escalante? Okay, yes, and certainly Ricardo has played a big role, and Gabriella. And so I just want to thank all of the people who've really made it possible for me to be here. Of course, I'm a child of the 1960s, and I participated in social movements in the civil rights, the latter stages of the civil rights movement, and then in the Black Power movement. And I, of course, have been aware of the movement here in Mexico and the tragic massacre. And I just want you to know that from my perspective, the courage and the vision of those young people should never be forgotten. We should always study that period and see what is it that we can learn from what happened back then, so that that study of that period will guide how we go forward. Of course, you know, at the same time in 1968, I think about 10 days later after the massacre was the Summer Olympics here in Mexico. And in America, especially African Americans, black people, we never forgot the Black Power salute of the three runners in the Olympics. And once again, all of these movements were tied together. And I would also say that in many ways, the civil rights movement in America and the Black Power movement was a trigger, was one of the major triggers to the movements that happened all across the world, including here in Mexico and in Prague and in many other places. Now, what I want to do is, I'm drawing from my recent book called The Scholar Denied, and it's The Scholar Denied and the birth, W.B. Du Bois and the birth of modern sociology. What I want to say to start this out is that, as you all know, movements do not develop spontaneously. There is a history to movements. There are institutional structures that are necessary for movements to mobilize and to flower into major protest struggles. And so then, when we think about the civil rights movement in the United States, it is wrong to think that it started in Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and Martin Luther King became the charismatic leader. That movement had been going on in some form or fashion in the United States since slavery. And in fact, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat that day, and the movement was mobilized around Mrs. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. was not yet even in the picture. And after they mobilized over a 2 or 3 day period, the local leaders in Montgomery, Alabama said, well, we need a spokesperson for this movement. We need someone who could speak to the world about what is going on here. And Martin Luther King Jr. had just arrived in Montgomery, Alabama as a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Church. And they said, well, there's this young preacher here that's very articulate and charismatic. Perhaps we should try to convince him to be our spokesperson. And so the lesson there is that no individual, no charismatic leader create a movement. The movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, created Dr. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King did not create the civil rights movement. So the importance here in my talk to you today is to ask the question, what were some of the other basic important factors that gave rise to the civil rights movement? And therefore, I want to focus on the great scholar and sociologist, W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois was born in 1968 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And as you know, this was only 3 years after American slavery ended. And W.B. Du Bois became one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century in the United States as well as across the world, because he was very international in his thinking. Now, the key argument, one of the key arguments of my book, The Scholar Denied, is simply this: that at this particular time in the late 19th century and throughout the period up until the 1960s, Black people in the United States were viewed as inferior. And so that when we look at the social sciences during this period, at the turn of the 20th century, we look at biology and we look at literature, there was one consensus among all of the disciplines in the United States, and that is that Black people were inferior. This notion of Black inferiority came about during slavery. How do you justify enslaving millions of people in a country claiming to be a democracy? And the way that slavery was justified is that Black people were not fully human. that they were subhuman, that they were more akin to chimpanzees than to human beings, and that therefore it was not a problem with democracy to enslave millions of people because they were, in fact, not complete people. So I want to underscore this notion of the claim that was accepted in science, accepted in the political arena, accepted in the economic arena, that black people were an inferior race. So then when Du Bois started to study at Fisk University, that's where he received his bachelor's degree, and then he's going to go on to Harvard, and he's going to go on to the University of Berlin. So I want to just give you some idea of who Du Bois really was, and that is that if you think about it, here is this consensus that black people are inferior. But the problem was that the society had with Du Bois is that he became one of the most educated persons in the world, having received a bachelor's degree from the historically black university, Fisk University in Tennessee, then having gone on to Harvard, where he earned both another bachelor's degree as well as the first African American to receive the PhD. He received a PhD in history. They didn't even have a sociology department at that time. And so here's a situation then where black people are being portrayed within the universities and throughout the society as inferior. And Du Bois's own accomplishment was jarringly inconsistent with this notion of black inferiority. And so then it is also important for me to point out that Du Bois studied at the University of Berlin. And at that time, most elite black social scientists in the United States went to Germany to study under the great social scientists like Schmoller and Wagner and others. And so Du Bois was there studying under them. He was well aware that here was this scientific racism declaring that he and his people were inferior. And so what he's going to do then is that he's going to go to work to dismantle scientific racism. And in so doing, what happens is, and this is a key argument in my book, is that Du Bois became the first social scientist in America to create scientific sociology. Up until that point, sociology was largely social philosophy. The founders in America of sociology, the white male founders of sociology, they did very little empirical work. They largely did what's now called armchair theorizing, that they had these great ideas and they would just write them down without any empirical data, without doing field work, without interviewing people and so on. And Du Bois's notion was that the only way that you could conclude that black people were inferior was to do so based on faulty studies that were racially biased. And so then from 1898 to 1910, he worked at the Atlanta University of Black School, and he built up a whole school of sociology, which I call the Atlanta School of Sociology. Now, the fundamental premise of the Atlanta School of Sociology was that science was wrong, it was not empirically based, and that the notion that black people were inferior was in fact a lie. And so he's going to devote his entire career to proving that black people were not inferior. But of course, he also made the same kinds of arguments about women, that they were not inferior either. And so then through literally hundreds of studies, Du Bois worked on the black community, interviewing, doing census work, statistical work, and ethnographic work, and published all of these major works showing that black people were not inferior. Now, I want to say also, so that the key argument here being that a black man situated in a black university around 1900 was the founder of scientific sociology in America, and that this flies in the face of the accepted wisdom. The accepted wisdom is that scientific sociology was founded at the University of Chicago in 1892, and that it was founded by all white males, people like W.I. Thomas and Robert Park and others. And this has been the narrative of the origins of sociology in America for the last century. And so my argument is that it is wrong. It is inaccurate, because when you look at the studies and you look at the methodologies, you look at the field work and so forth, that Du Bois was the first to bring real science into sociology and to build up the evidence, that black people were not inferior. Now, another important thing, I want to be real clear that if you were to compare W.B. Du Bois's CV, his resume, with all of the other social scientists during the period, very few came anywhere close to being as prolific as Du Bois. It has been demonstrated that from 18 years old until 95, that Du Bois published something on average, he published something, books, articles, essays, every 12th day of his life. And so when you look at this kind of productivity, and when you look at the quality of it, there were very few who could compare. Now, there is another very important thing about Du Bois, is that he, while being this great scholar, this great sociologist, this great social scientist that is changing basic and fundamental premises, is that he was also an activist. He was one of the major activists of the 20th century. From the very beginning in 1905, he helped organize what was known as the Niagara Movement. It was the first major national organization to fight against racism and racial inequality and racial segregation. In 1900, he also become a founding member of the Pan-African movement that studied black people throughout the world and also organized them to fight colonialism and racism throughout the world. Now, let me just say that it would be narrow to think of Du Bois as a person, a scholar who studied black people, who studied race. No. He studied how modernity came into being. And he argued that the slave trade and centuries of slavery and colonialism were major determinants of modernity, of capitalism. Therefore, in sociology now, there is the Trinity, the great gods who are said to have created sociology: Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber. But the fact of the matter is that none of them, in their theories of modernity, none of them paid any attention to the role of race and to the role of the slave trade and the role of slavery and the role of colonialism in generating modern capitalism. So Du Bois argues that modern capitalism itself was based on racial inequality, racial stratification, and colonialism. And so he stands alone as a major grand theorist of modernity and of the development of capitalism. He also made the argument about how do human beings come to develop the human self. And he argued with a theory that he called double consciousness, showing that it's not only communications and social interactions that the self arises from, but it's also power relations. And in the United States and other parts of the world, it was also racism that shaped how black people identified themselves, their very identity. But it also shaped how white people developed their self, that they came to see themselves as superior to everyone else. You know, why did that happen? And so Du Bois has theories about that. So let me get back to the point then, is that the major movements, many of the major movements, struggles to overthrow racism, struggles to overthrow gender inequality, struggles to overthrow class inequality. Du Bois was a leader in those movements. He was a theoretician of those movements. So the critical thing then is this, is that Du Bois laid the intellectual framework, the intellectual foundation for the rise of the civil rights movement, long before the modern civil rights movement, long before Martin Luther King. He laid the intellectual blueprint, and he argued, unlike any other white social scientist, he argued in the early 20th century that a major movement was going to come along, that was going to be organized by black people, and that was going to be based in the black church. No white sociologist had any idea that the civil rights movement was coming. They were caught totally unaware. We like to say jokingly in the black community is that the white sociologist was caught with their pants down, had no idea that the civil rights movement was coming. The question becomes, why didn't they have any idea? Because they bought into the theory of black inferiority. Inferior people don't organize a movement like the civil rights movement. Inferior people don't have the leaders to organize a movement like that. Inferior people don't have the institutions like the black church to organize what became the civil rights movement. So Du Bois then was a major theoretician of the civil rights movement, which King and others acknowledged. But not only that, because Du Bois had been such an activist and had created had been a founder with others of many of the organizations that King and others are going to draw on. Not only did W.B. Du Bois create the intellectual foundation for the civil rights movement, but he also created an infrastructure of protest, arguing that black people would never be free if they relied on whites to change their minds and give them their freedom. So Du Bois then was the major activist. So what is the bottom line there then? The bottom line is that great scholarship and great activism can marry, can go together, can enhance each other. And so then Du Bois demonstrated that this idea that the scholar is supposed to be aloof, supposed to be objective, supposed not to enter into the fray of the day, to stay away from social movements, to stay away from politics. Du Bois proved that that was very fallacious thinking, because here what we have is a very accomplished scholar and an activist. Martin Luther King said with Du Bois, "We never knew where the scholar ended and the organizer began." That he combined these roles in a very seamless way. Now, I want to rush to a kind of conclusion by saying that by going to Du Bois's position on young people and protest movements. So then, Du Bois's example of scholarship and activism are relevant for contemporary movements, including Black Lives Matter, Because Black Lives Matter is a decentralized movement, and it was one that was organized to deal with police brutality in the black community, also organized to seek social justice more largely. But what I want to say to you is that young people, especially students, usually propel movements. Most successful movements utilize young people because of their flexible schedules, because of their energy, because of their idealism, and because of their innovative thinking. The role of young people, that is students, as you know, in the 1968 massacre here, the young people were crucial. Indeed, the general director of the IPN, I guess it's CASA, may be pronouncing that wrong, but here's what he had to say about the young people in the movement here. He says that the legacy of the movement is invaluable because it showed that young people have the capacity to generate the changes that lead the country to better stages of freedom and well-being, where dialogue is privileged and where society and government walk along converging paths. I'll leave that to you as to whether government and freedom are walking the same path. I can't say much about that. But then, not surprisingly, young people played crucial roles in movements of Du Bois's day. How did Du Bois respond to young protesters? Did he advise them to embrace the politics of respectability and just try to get a better job and just try to engage in upward mobility? Or did Du Bois advise students to initiate protests and attack injustice head on? So Du Bois's response to student protests in the 1920s at his alma mater provides shining examples of his stance. So Fisk University at this time had a white president. And all of the racism that was going on at the school, he did nothing about it. The other problem, of course, was that at black schools during this time, they had to depend on white money. And so students then were counseled by the president and by the faculty not to rebel. Nevertheless, these students broke rank and they rebelled. Du Bois supported the young protesters, quote, and here again, we are always actually or potentially saying hush to children and to students. We are putting on a soft pedal. We are teaching them subterfuge and compromise. We are leading them around to back doors for fear that they shall express themselves. And yet, whenever and wherever we do this, we are wrong. Absolutely and eternally wrong. Unless we are willing to train our children to be cowards, to run like dogs when they are kicked, to whine and lick the hands that slaps them. We've got to teach them self-actualization and self-expression. And so then, when the protests by these young black students in segregated Tennessee emerged and engaged in disruption, Du Bois said this. And we could see him clearly embracing the politics of disruption. Quote, and again and for a second time, and with no advice, no instigation from without, the students rioted and struck. They pounded ash cans. They sang. They yelled. And they broke windows. I thank God that they did. I thank God that the younger generation of black students have the guts to yell and fight when they are insulted, mocked, and oppressed. A spontaneous rebellion of young and hurt souls who refuse to submit to calculated and remorseless tyranny is a splendid and a heartening thing. I think that it is time for us to make sure here at this university and universities around the world to incorporate knowledge of prior struggles, to make sure that the curriculum reflect what happened here in 1968, that it lift up the vision and the courage of those who fought and died during that period. So then, when we actually bring into view those struggles and those scholars who have fought to change the world for a better place, then I think that we will have a much more vibrant academy. So then, as Ella Jo Baker, who was one of the major leaders of the modern civil rights movement in the United States, she was the leader, the executive director early on of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She said that we who believe in freedom cannot rest. So I would just end by saying once again that the vision and the courage of those who fought and died in 1968 here, that we must never forget that movement, and that we need to incorporate it centrally at the core of our studies, our reflections, and how we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. Creo que tenemos bastantes temas que merecerían ampliarse con una discusión. La dinámica que vamos a seguir es la siguiente. Le vamos a pedir a Tom Rochon que suba al escenario, Aldon lo escuchará abajo, y después los tres estaremos aquí en un último momento de conversación conjunta para reunir los argumentos de ambas pláticas. Du Bois es un pensador crítico que comienza a responder al malestar de una época y que, como bien advertía Aldon Morris, en el tiempo sus ideas se convierten en movimiento social o alimentan un movimiento social. Thomas Rochon escribió un texto en los años 90, Cultural Moves, movimientos culturales, donde justamente registra esta dinámica entre el pensamiento crítico, las comunidades críticas y los movimientos sociales. Voy a adelantar un argumento que seguramente él dará, pero en efecto las ideas de la enciclopedia quizá no se habrían dado a conocer, no se habrían democratizado sin el movimiento de la Revolución Francesa. Y ese doble juego es lo que explica en el tiempo los grandes cambios culturales. Nuevamente, en el ánimo de observar el fenómeno del movimiento del 68 en un lapso de tiempo, en un lapso más amplio, ahora le pedimos a Thomas Rochon que nos hable de los ciclos de movilización, de la construcción de derechos y cambio de mapas mentales que se observan en estos movimientos sociales y desde luego centrándonos en el movimiento del 68 como pretexto para observar el pasado y también nuestro presente. So, the voice is yours, Tom. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm, much like Aldon, very grateful, and more than grateful, honored to be part of this colloquium. It's a colloquium filled for the entire month of September with scholarship and reflection, performance. But I think underlying that is the fact that this is a colloquium that honors the 1968 student activists and honors activists in all movements around the world in 1968 and in other years who make incredible personal sacrifices and in many ways, as Aldon pointed out so brilliantly in one specific case, in many ways have created a world that we live in today that is a bit of a kinder world than the world of the past, even if it's not as kind of a world as we would like. So one thing that strikes me as we look back on a movement legacy is that we focus on different things than we're focused on at the time. As a movement unfolds, the focus tends to be on its tactics and its leading personalities. And many of the voices are going to be critical of the movement. Is the movement breaking the law with its marches and demonstrations? Is it unpatriotic, perhaps even treasonous, to criticize the president or the government and its policies? And on the other side, the voices, is the government, are the police at fault for their violent response to movement demonstrations and demands? Those are the questions of the moment, and they are important questions, and they remain important questions today. Sadly, questions of accountability for government actions are still very present in Mexico today. But those questions are joined by others about the significance of the movement. With the perspective of 50 years, it's possible to see a bigger picture of what led up to movement activism and what followed. There's an art installation at the Centro Cultural Universitario Tlatelolco later today, I believe, that features footprints of the disappeared, footprints set in concrete. And those footprints are a perfect metaphor for the long-term legacy that movements leave. The social movements, including the social movements of 1968 student movement in Mexico, lead to a different setting, a different climate that we live in today than in the past. And as we talk about that, I'd like to ask that you first think for a moment about all of the institutional and cultural forces that are aligned against any change in values or behavior. We learn our core values from our parents, and they learn those values, the way of seeing the world, from their parents. Churches, schools, neighbors, all press toward inherited values and continuity. Governments define citizenship according to the opportunities for participation and expression that they have created and sanctioned. All of these social forces are further strengthened by an awareness within each of us that life is simply easier. The best way to thrive and to prosper is to go along with the prevailing values and expectations. And so, given all those forces for continuity, isn't it remarkable that social movements for change ever come into being? Isn't it remarkable that one way of seeing the world is replaced by another way of seeing the world so thoroughly that it's easy to miss the difference unless you look back over a longer period of time? In any given era, I think we're under the illusion that our core values have always been the core values, and that to the extent people behaved differently in an earlier era, it's because they were selfish or they were morally perverse. People have always known what justice is, we think, and they always defined it as we defined it. They simply did not always act on that knowledge. We underestimate the extent to which people in the past believed they were acting justly based on a very different set of values and different understandings of the world than the ones we hold today. Now, I stumbled on this insight almost by accident, picking up a magazine in an antique store. The magazine was called Life, and it was one of the most popular weekly feature magazines in the United States from the 1940s until about the 1960s. It was composed of beautiful photographs and a minimum of text. Life magazine was a portrait of how middle-class Americans wanted to live and what they were supposed to be thinking about. So I saw a pile of old Life magazines in an antique store, and I picked up a copy published the week that I was born. Here is the full-page ad on the back cover of that magazine. Now, this advertisement could never be found in a magazine today, and there's no great mystery why. Scientific knowledge has advanced our understanding of the effects of smoking on our health, and in the United States, at least, it's no longer legal to advertise cigarettes in print magazines without including prominent warnings about the health hazards of smoking. So the goal of this advertisement was to sell cigarettes, but it would not sell cigarettes today. It actually wouldn't be legal, but if it were printed, it would just provoke laughter. When I leafed through the magazine, I found other examples of dramatic change that could not simply be tied to advances in knowledge. I'd like you to consider the following full-page advertisement placed by a company that sold military equipment to the United States government. Now, this advertisement was printed in 1952, at a time when a combat group such as this one would have been all male. But the United States Army was already integrated at that time, with men of different races and ethnic groups serving together. The 1952 Life magazine image of what the American military looked like had not yet caught up with a reality that was at that time rapidly changing. A generation later, After the civil rights movement and its descendants still today raise awareness and aspirations for social justice in American society, we look with pride on the diversity of our military. Today, any advertisement that portrayed the military the way you see it here would provoke controversy and condemnation. And it's not only in the United States that shifts of perspective have caused the images of a previous era to seem a little bit odd, or maybe not worded the way you would word it today. My point is simply this: when cultural values change, we interpret things differently. The messages that made sense to an earlier generation do not carry the same meaning for us today. Now, how does all of this connect to social movements in general and to the Mexico student movement in 1968? My study of movements in Europe and the United States has not so much been focused on the movement mobilizations themselves, but instead on what came before and what comes after the movement. Given all those forces for continuity of values in society, what might lead tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to demand that we see the world in a different way? And then, when the movement mobilization has come to an end, what happens to those values that were in such dramatic opposition to the prevailing way of thinking and acting? I'd like to discuss two general principles that connect movements to changes in social values and in politics, and I will relate lightly those principles to the Mexico student movement in 1968 based on what I understand of it. My first point, actually, has already been wonderfully made by Aldon Morris, which is that there is an intellectual and theoretical foundation for any social movement. W.E.B. Du Bois is an example of a great single intellect who was important to a movement, but my emphasis tends to be more on the community, the network of intellects that I call a critical community. Before the movement can ever appear, there has to be a perceived gap between the core values and the reality of our experience. Before you can be aware of that gap between ideals and reality, those alternative ideals must be stated in a compelling way that highlights the shortcomings of the status quo. Yes, people will say to themselves and to each other, I knew something was not right, but now I have a name for it. Now I know that I'm not alone in that feeling, and now I believe it's time for change. So it's the vital work of the critical community to name the problem and to identify instances of the problem in our institutions and our practices. That very act of naming the problem and precisely identifying instances of it increases the sense that something is wrong and leads to a determination to act. Now, there have always been influential critics of society, going back at least to Socrates and certainly before him. But it's a special trait of modern societies that they have many more opportunities for critical communities to develop and for their ideas to spread in society at large. In Europe, at the time of the Enlightenment, individual philosophers and intellectuals lived by the patronage of aristocrats, and that's a source of support, as you would imagine, that could be revoked at any time. The philosophes in pre-revolutionary France represented a breakthrough in that they developed a true critical community, and they were able to support themselves and express their ideas through plays, novels, journalism, and so forth. But even then, in that golden era of social criticism, material and political security was elusive for the philosophe. Voltaire spent part of his life in exile in Prussia and England. Rousseau fled to England and then to Geneva. Diderot found exile in Russia. It's a very different story for critical communities today. Critics of society now find a readership and a security of existence that the philosophe would have envied. But critical communities are more than the work of individuals, and perhaps even more important is the creation of institutions that connect individuals to each other and give them a degree of autonomy and of material security that enables them to develop their critical perspectives. Chief among those institutions is the modern university. Everything about the modern university, from lifetime tenure granted to faculty to the expectation that they will serve as incubators of innovative thinking, is perfectly designed to serve as a home to critical communities. The organization of the university itself into schools, departments, and institutes advances connections among individuals with common interests. And this encourages the kind of give and take among scholars that sharpens ideas and connects them to concrete problems and actions. I've long believed, long before I received an invitation to come here today, that UNAM has the best name of any university in the entire world. By incorporating the word autonomo into the name of this remarkable university, there's an explicit assertion of the university's necessary independence from outside social and political institutions. And I understand that that autonomy is not always honored fully. We're here to talk about a time when that autonomy was not honored. But the assertion of autonomy and independence is so very important. To get a specific idea of how university research connects to social movements and changing values, we can look at the history of research on climate change. All you really need to see is that pattern of dramatic rise in the number of research papers produced over just a 2-decade period on climate change. This is an example that can be generalized to every set of issues that's been the focus of a major social movement mobilization in the United States. I did a count of the number of university-affiliated research institutes in the United States in 1965 and again in 1997 on 4 areas, all of which were associated with social movements. Now, there was in general a rapid growth of universities in the United States during those decades from the 1960s to the 1990s. It was fed by a large increase in the number of college students, also by greater prosperity in the country. But that growth is not across the board on every subject of inquiry. As of 1965, the labor movement was well established in the United States, and labor relations were the focus of more research institutes than the other 3 areas combined. But the civil rights movement, the peace movements of the 1960s through 1980s, and the women's movements that began in the 1960s were all accompanied by rapid growth in study and thinking in those areas. The big winner in research institute growth is the environment. In fact, I had to put it on a different graph because the scale is so dramatically different. There were over 1,300 institutes on university campuses focused on the environment by 1997. Shows a very close connection between social movements and university studies. Now, research institutes are actually a lagging indicator of critical communities. Critical communities begin when scholars do their own thinking and find some like-minded scholars and exchange ideas with those scholars through more informal means. I know the ideas espoused by the student movement in Mexico in 1968 were also developed in critical communities, and although I don't know much about the networks of intellectuals who supported them, and as you know, there were 2 core values behind the student movement of 1968, one centered on social justice and the other on freedom. The students of 1968 embraced social justice issues because of the gap they saw between the ideals of the revolution and the realities of the world around them. And in Mexico, as elsewhere in the world, I well remember it from my campus in the United States, students of the 1960s had a deep fascination with Marxism in general and with Cuba in particular. The contrast between the idealized version of the Cuban economy and the realities of uneven economic development elsewhere created a longing for a different model. The second strand of critical thought was focused on freedom. Freedom of the press, political freedom to assemble and voice one's beliefs, and individual freedoms to make choices in one's own life. The student protests were coupled on these issues with a highly developed critique of many social and political institutions in Mexico, which is why I think it's so hard to state the political agenda of that movement in just a few words. The '68 student movement sought change in almost everything. But with each major protest march, the government response became harsher, the need for change became more apparent, and as a result, ultimately, the government's violent destruction of the protest movement became a powerful lesson on the nature of the regime and itself a symbol of the need for change. I know it was unacceptable to many Mexicans to see protesting students slaughtered in the public square. The problem did not have to be named by a critical community at that point. It was vividly illustrated, which made the Mexican student movement in 1968 the focal point for a network of critical thought on the lack of freedom in Mexican political institutions that grew after the movement rather than shrinking. Journalists, novelists, filmmakers found common themes in advocating for a society in which people could organize, assemble, and speak. There was there were increased loosening of the tight controls created by the network of support organizations under the sponsorship of the PRI. These voices were increasingly heard and acted upon, which takes me to my second principle, the long-term influence of political and social movements. And that principle is that the influence of movements is more often indirect than direct, and it is best seen over the long term rather than the short term. And to see why, I think it's helpful to distinguish between political movements and social movements. We sometimes use those terms interchangeably, but I'd like to make some distinctions between them. Political movements are campaigns that are focused on concrete objectives, such as passage of reform legislation, or perhaps removal of the incumbent party from office. Social movements differ from political movements in every single one of these traits. Their goal is not to change laws or institutions, but instead to change social values and patterns of behavior. Their emphasis on thoughts and actions of people in their everyday lives means that the strategy of social movements is to promote discussion, leading to greater awareness, or to a new way of seeing the subject. But even so, distinguishing between political change and social change goals of a movement helps us better understand tactical choices and long-term impacts. A silent march, such as that of September 13th, 1968 to the Zocalo, is hard to understand as a tactic to pressure governmental institutions to alter their course. But those tactics can be powerful as a means of causing people to drop their judgments against a movement's activities and instead focus on the goals being expressed. So, I hope this morning to have been able to offer a long-term perspective on how social movements change social values and on the impact of Mexico 1968 student movement. Although cultural values and political institutions are normally very stable, there are moments in any society when large numbers of people question those institutions and whether they are truly serving our needs. That questioning is intensified by movement mobilizations during which large numbers of people disrupt their lives and take risks in order to demand change. Movement mobilizations do not simply arise on their own. They are fed by the thinking developed within critical communities. And the impact of these mobilizations is not measured by the immediate violent response to shouted slogans or raised fists, but rather it's measured by the long-term change in cultural values and patterns of action that echo movement demands. The student movement of 1968 has been and still remains a major impetus to the transformation of Mexican civil society and political institutions. You can imagine how honored I am to be here and to be a small part of it. Thank you.
Cerramos esta mesa
Thank you. We
con
close.
tres ideas que son principales. Entender los movimientos sociales que estamos viviendo hoy y probablemente los que veremos en el futuro pasan por observar los liderazgos intelectuales, políticos, con justamente el de Du Bois y otros que han sido mencionados a lo largo del coloquio. También las comunidades críticas, cómo se construyen ese conjunto de redes alrededor de las iglesias, alrededor de las universidades, de las revistas, de cualquier ejercicio epistémico. Y desde luego también tenemos que hablar de los movimientos sociales que democratizan los valores de esas comunidades críticas. Hace un momento se hablaba de cómo este bagaje transforma instituciones y tiene que ver con las instituciones relacionadas con la justicia, con los expedientes judiciales, con las demandas judiciales. En la siguiente mesa tenemos al ministro José Ramón Cosío. Muchas gracias, José Ramón, por estar aquí. Justamente que nos va a hablar cómo en aquel entonces esos expedientes judiciales fueron tratados y ojalá y nos ayude a entender cómo ha evolucionado el derecho y las instituciones jurídicas del 68 a la fecha. Les doy las gracias a Aldon y a Tomás.